Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I never believed in premonitions until that February night on Highway 83 in North Dakota. I was driving my semi from Fargo to Minot, a route I'd taken hundreds of times over the past 5 years. The weather report called for light snow, maybe an inch or two, nothing a trucker from Minnesota couldn't handle. But as I crossed into McHenry County around 9 p.m., something felt wrong. The air had that electric quality you get before a major storm, and my radio started picking up strange interference. Static mixed with what sounded like voices speaking in a language I couldn't identify. I figured it was just atmospheric disturbance from the approaching weather system. The snow started as promised, light flakes dancing in my headlights. But within 20 minutes it transformed into something biblical. The wind picked up, howling across the prairie like a living thing, and visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet. I'd driven through blizzards before, but this felt different. Malevolent? My GPS lost signal first, then my CB radio went dead. Even my cell phone showed no bars, which was impossible on this stretch of highway. I was completely cut off from the outside world, crawling along at 15 miles per hour with my hazards flashing, hoping to find somewhere to pull over and wait it out. That's when I saw the other truck. It appeared in my mirrors like a ghost, following maybe 50 yards behind me. At first, I was relieved. Another driver dealing with the same nightmare conditions. But as the minutes passed, something about its behavior started bothering me. It matched my speed exactly, never trying to pass, never falling back. Just maintaining that precise distance like it was tethered to my rig. I tried flashing my brake lights, the universal trucker's signal for everything okay. No response. I slowed down to let it pass. It slowed down too. When I sped up slightly, it sped up. The whole time I couldn't make out the driver through the swirling snow and darkness. After an hour of this strange dance, I spotted what looked like a truck stop ahead. The neon sign was barely visible through the storm, but I could make out Pete's 24-hour flickering in red letters. I'd never seen this place before, but I'd take any port in this storm. I pulled into the parking lot, my trailer sliding slightly on the ice. The other truck followed me in, parking in the space directly across from mine. I sat in my cab for a moment, engine running, trying to get a better look at the driver, but the windshield was covered in snow, and I couldn't see anything through the darkness. The truck stop looked wrong somehow. The building was there, lights on, but there were no other vehicles in the lot. No tire tracks in the snow except mine and the mystery trucks. In a storm like this, every trucker within 50 miles should have been holed up here. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold hit me like a physical blow, and the wind nearly knocked me over. I hurried toward the building, glancing back at the other truck. Its engine was still running, exhaust visible in the frigid air, but I still couldn't see the driver. The door to Pete's opened with a cheerful chime that seemed absurdly normal given the circumstances. Inside, it looked like every truck stop I'd ever been in. Fluorescent lights, coffee station, rows of snacks and road atlases. But it was completely empty. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed strangely in the silence. A man emerged from behind the counter, middle-aged, wearing a Pete's uniform shirt. Friendly smile. But his eyes were all wrong, too bright, too knowing. "Rough night out there," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "You picked a good time to stop." "Yeah, came out of nowhere," I replied, stamping snow off my boots. "You seen another driver come in? There's a truck parked right outside." The man's smile never wavered. "You're the only customer we've had tonight. Storm's keeping everyone away." I looked through the windows. The other truck was still there, exhaust still visible. but the man behind the counter acted like it didn't exist. "Coffee's fresh," he continued, "on the house for drivers caught in weather like this." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I mumbled thanks and poured myself a cup, mostly to have something to do with my hands. The coffee was scalding hot, as if it had just finished brewing, but the pot looked like it had been sitting there for hours. I tried to make small talk, asking about road conditions ahead, when the place might get plowed out. But every answer he gave was vague, non-committal, and those eyes never stopped watching me with that unsettling intensity. After 20 minutes, I couldn't stand it anymore. I thanked him for the coffee and headed back outside, telling myself I'd wait out the storm in my cab. But when I pushed through the door, the other truck was gone. Not driven away, gone. No tire tracks leading out of the parking lot. No sign it had ever been there except for the space where it had been parked, now filled with undisturbed snow as if it had been empty all night. I stood there in the howling wind, staring at the impossible absence. The snow was falling so hard that tracks should have been covered within minutes. But there wasn't even a depression in the snow where a 40-ton truck had been sitting. I climbed back into my cab, hands shaking as I started the engine. The storm was still raging, but I couldn't stay at Pete's another minute. Something was fundamentally wrong with that place, with that man, with this entire situation. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in my mirrors one last time. The truck stop was still there, lights still on, but it looked different somehow, faded, like an old photograph left in the sun. I drove through the blizzard for another 3 hours, white-knuckling it at 20 miles per hour. When the storm finally broke around 2 a.m., I found myself on a stretch of Highway 83 I knew well. I pulled over and checked my GPS, trying to figure out where I'd been. According to the map, there was no truck stop on this section of highway, no Pete's 24-hour, no building of any kind for 30 miles in either direction. I called my dispatcher the next morning, told him I'd been delayed by weather. Didn't mention the truck stop or the mysterious semi that had followed me. Who would believe it? But I started asking around, talking to other drivers who ran that route regularly. 3 of them had stories. Similar experiences on nights when the weather turned bad. A truck stop that appeared out of nowhere. A man behind the counter with eyes that didn't look quite right. And always another truck that followed them through the storm before vanishing without a trace. One driver, an old-timer named Carl who'd been running freight for 30 years, pulled me aside after I told my story. "You ever hear of a Highway 83 during the winter of 1987? He asked, his voice low. "Blizzard came through, lasted 3 days. 7 truckers went missing on that stretch. Never found the trucks, never found the drivers. Search and rescue called it off after a week." He lit a cigarette with hands that shook slightly. "Some folks say they're still out there, driving through storms that ended decades ago, looking for other drivers to follow home. I don't run Highway 83 anymore, especially not in winter. I take the long way around, add 6 hours to my route, and my dispatcher thinks I'm getting soft in my old age. But every time I see snow in the forecast, I remember those eyes behind the counter at Pete's. And I wonder if that truck is still out there, waiting in the storm for the next driver foolish enough to believe in a truck stop that doesn't exist. Sometimes, on clear nights when I'm driving through North Dakota, I'll catch a glimpse of headlights in my mirrors that disappear when I look directly at them. And I'll press a little harder on the accelerator because I know that some roads are better traveled alone." The blizzard hit while I was somewhere between Grand Forks and Fargo on Interstate 29. I'm a pharmaceutical sales rep, and I'd been making my rounds through North Dakota's smaller hospitals when the weather took a turn for the worse. What started as light flurries around 4 p.m. had escalated into a full-scale whiteout by the time I reached the middle of nowhere. My Honda Civic wasn't built for conditions like this, I should have stayed put in Grand Forks, but I had a presentation in Minneapolis the next morning, and I thought I could outrun the storm. Pride comes before the fall, as my grandmother used to say. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I was crawling along at maybe 20 miles per hour, hazard lights flashing following the faint red glow of taillights ahead of me. The car behind those lights became my lifeline in the swirling white chaos. As long as I could see them, I knew I was still on the road. But after an hour of this nerve-wracking convoy, the taillights suddenly veered right and disappeared. I assumed the driver had taken an exit, but when I crept forward, I realized there was no exit. The lights had simply vanished into the storm. Now I was alone on the interstate with zero visibility and no idea where I was. My GPS had lost signal 20 minutes earlier, and my cell phone showed no bars. The radio was nothing but static. I was completely isolated in a metal box, surrounded by a wall of white. That's when I saw the abandoned car. It materialized out of the snow like a ghost, sitting in the right lane about 50 yards ahead. A dark sedan, maybe a Toyota or Honda, covered in a thick layer of snow that suggested it had been there for hours. No hazard lights, no signs of life. I pulled up behind it and put my car in park, leaving the engine running. Through my windshield wipers, I could see that the back window was clear of snow, as if someone had recently wiped it clean from the inside, but the car looked empty. I sat there for several minutes, debating what to do. Every instinct told me to drive around the abandoned vehicle and keep moving. But what if someone was inside, unconscious or worse? What if they needed help? Finally, my conscience won out. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold was brutal, cutting through my business suit like it was made of paper. Snow immediately began accumulating on my glasses, making it even harder to see. I approached the driver's side of the car, my dress shoes slipping on the ice beneath the snow. The windows were fogged up from the inside, which meant the car had been warm recently. Someone had definitely been in there. I knocked on the window. "Hello? Are you okay in there?" No response. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. The door swung open with a creak of protest from frozen hinges. The car was empty, but the engine was still warm. The keys hung from the ignition, and the gas gauge showed 3/4 full. On the passenger seat, I found a purse and a cell phone. The phone was dead, but the purse contained a driver's license belonging to Sarah Chen, age 28, from Minneapolis. What struck me as odd was the condition of the car's interior. No signs of panic or struggle. The seat was adjusted normally, the mirrors were properly positioned, and there was even a half-finished cup of coffee in the cup holder, still slightly warm. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished mid-drive. I called out into the storm, "Sarah, Sarah, are you out here?" But my voice was swallowed by the wind. If she had left the car for any reason, she would have been invisible in the whiteout within seconds. I was about to get back in my own car when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the snow around Sarah's car, there were no footprints. None at all. Not even the ones I should have made walking from my car to hers. The snow was falling fast, but not that fast. There should have been some trace of human activity around an abandoned vehicle. Instead, the snow lay pristine and undisturbed, as if the car had been dropped from the sky. I backed away from the vehicle, my heart racing. Something was very wrong here. I needed to get back to my car and find help, find a way to report this to the police. But when I turned around, my Honda was gone. I stood there in the storm, staring at the empty space where my car had been parked just minutes before. Like Sarah's footprints, there was no trace it had ever been there. No tire tracks, no depression in the snow, nothing. Panic hit me like a physical blow. I was stranded in a blizzard with no transportation, no way to call for help, and no explanation for what was happening. The rationale part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation, but logic felt very far away in that howling white void. I ran back to Sarah's car and climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. At least it was warm and sheltered. I tried to start the engine, but nothing happened. The car that had been running moments before was now completely dead. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint but unmistakable. The metallic scent of blood. It seemed to be coming from the back seat. I turned around slowly, dreading what I might find. The back seat looked empty, but in the dim light from my phone's flashlight, I could see dark stains on the upholstery. Stains that definitely looked like dried blood. My phone's battery was at 15%, and the cold was draining it fast. I had maybe 20 minutes of light left. I tried calling 911, but there was still no signal. The phone was useless, except as a flashlight. I was trapped in a car that smelled like death, surrounded by a blizzard that seemed to be erasing reality itself. Cars were disappearing, footprints weren't forming, and somewhere out in that white hell, Sarah Chen was missing. As I sat there trying to process the situation, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Tapping. Someone was tapping on the passenger side window. I turned toward the sound, my phone's light cutting through the darkness. Through the fogged glass, I could see the outline of a person standing outside the car. They were tapping with what looked like fingernails, a slow, rhythmic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. "Sarah," I called out. "Sarah, is that you?" The tapping stopped. The figure outside remained motionless for a long moment, then began moving around the car. I tracked its progress by the sound of footsteps in the snow, footsteps that I somehow knew wouldn't leave tracks. The figure completed a full circle around the car and stopped at the driver's side window, right next to my head. I could feel its presence through the glass, could sense it watching me, even though I couldn't make out any features in the darkness. Then it spoke, and the voice was definitely female, definitely young. But there was something wrong with it, something that didn't quite sound human. "You shouldn't have stopped," the voice said. "You should have kept driving." "Sarah? Sarah, I'm here to help. Are you hurt?" "You can't help," the voice replied. "No one can help. The storm takes what it wants." "What happened to you? Where's my car?" There was a long pause before she answered. "The storm is hungry tonight. It's been hungry for a long time." I pressed my face to the window, trying to see her clearly, but all I could make out was a pale oval where her face should be, and the suggestion of long, dark hair whipping in the wind. "Please," I said, "let me help you. We can figure this out together." "You still don't understand," Sarah's voice said, and now there was something like pity in it. "You're not here to help me. You're here to join me." The car began to shake. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the movement was too regular, too purposeful. Something was rocking the vehicle back and forth, and that something was getting stronger. My phone's battery hit 5%, and the light began to dim. In the fading illumination, I could see more figures gathering around the car, shapes that might have been human, standing motionless in the storm. Waiting. "How many?" I whispered. "Everyone who stopped," Sarah replied. "Everyone who tried to help. The storm has been feeding for decades." The rocking motion intensified, and I realized the car was being lifted off the ground. Through the windshield, I could see we were rising into the swirling snow, carried by forces I couldn't understand. My phone died, plunging me into absolute darkness. The last thing I heard was Sarah's voice, clearer now, as if she were sitting right beside me. "Welcome to the storm," she said. "Welcome home." They found my car 3 days later, abandoned on Interstate 29 with no explanation for how it got there. The keys were in the ignition, my wallet was on the passenger seat, but I was nowhere to be found. The police report mentioned that there were no footprints in the snow around the vehicle. Sarah Chen's car was never located. According to the missing persons database, she disappeared during a blizzard in 2019. But the strange thing is, there are reports of her car being spotted during winter storms throughout North Dakota and Minnesota. Always empty, always running, always waiting for the next Good Samaritan to stop and offer help. If you're ever driving through a blizzard and you see an abandoned car on the side of the road, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Some people can't be saved, and some storms never end. I was driving from Spokane to Duluth on Route 2, taking the northern route through Montana and North Dakota because I wanted to see the country. It was my first cross-country road trip, and I was feeling pretty good about myself until the weather turned ugly somewhere west of Minot. The snow started around 8 p.m., just as I was passing through a town called Stanley. Nothing too serious at first, just enough to make me turn on the wipers and slow down a bit. But by the time I reached the middle of nowhere between Stanley and Minot, it had escalated into something that belonged in a disaster movie. I'm from Phoenix originally, so I'd never driven in conditions like this. My rented Chevy Malibu felt like it was floating on the ice, and every gust of wind threatened to push me off the road. I should have pulled over and waited it out, but I was young and stupid and convinced I could handle anything. The highway was completely empty except for me. No other cars, no trucks, no signs of civilization anywhere. Just an endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into a wall of white. My GPS kept losing signal, and the radio was nothing but static. I felt like I was driving through the end of the world. That's when I started noticing the signs. They appeared out of the storm like ghosts. Green highway signs that should have been familiar but weren't. Vanishing Point, 15 miles. Vanishing Point, 10 miles. Vanishing Point, 5 miles. I'd never heard of a town called Vanishing Point. And it wasn't on any of my maps, but the signs were official-looking, standard Department of Transportation design. Maybe it was just a small community I'd missed in my research. The exit appeared exactly when the signs promised, a lonely off-ramp that curved away into the darkness. I almost drove past it, but something made me reconsider. I was low on gas, my hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel, and I desperately needed a break from the white-knuckle driving. The off-ramp led to a 2-lane road that seemed to stretch on forever. No buildings, no lights, no indication that I was heading toward any kind of town. Just more snow and darkness. I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake, but turning around seemed more dangerous than pressing forward. After about 10 minutes of driving through the middle of nowhere, I saw lights ahead. Not the warm glow of a town, but the harsh fluorescent glare of what looked like a truck stop or gas station. It sat alone in the prairie like a beacon of civilization. As I got closer, I could see it was indeed a gas station, along with what appeared to be a small diner attached to the main building. The sign out front read, "Last Stop Gas and Eats," in faded red letters. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which struck me as odd given the weather conditions. I pulled up to the gas pumps and sat in my car for a moment, engine running. Something about the place felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. The building looked normal enough, typical rural gas station architecture, probably built in the 1980s, but it seemed too isolated, too empty for a night like this. I needed gas, though, and I needed to get warm. I stepped out into the blizzard and immediately regretted not bringing a heavier coat. The wind cut through my jacket like it wasn't even there, and the snow stung my face like tiny needles. The gas pump was old-fashioned, the kind where you had to pay inside first. I hurried toward the building, my shoes slipping on the ice-covered pavement. The door opened with a cheerful chime that seemed absurdly normal given the circumstances. Inside, the gas station looked exactly like every other rural gas station I'd ever been in. Rows of snacks and road atlases, a coffee station, a few tables near the diner counter, but like the parking lot, it was completely empty. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed strangely in the silence. A woman emerged from behind the counter, middle-aged, wearing a name tag that said Betty. She had a friendly smile, but her eyes looked tired, almost sad. "Rough night to be traveling," she said, her voice carrying a slight Midwestern accent. "You heading somewhere important?" "Just passing through," I replied, stamping snow off my shoes. "Need to fill up and maybe get some coffee. How much further to Minot?" Betty's smile faltered for just a moment. "Minot? Oh, honey, you're not going to make it to Minot tonight. Storm's only getting worse." She was right, of course. The wind was howling outside, and the snow was coming down so hard I could barely see my car through the windows. "Is there a motel around here?" I asked. "Somewhere I could wait out the storm?" "Afraid not," Betty said. "Vanishing Point's not much of a town. Just this place and a few houses scattered around. But you're welcome to stay here until it passes. I'll keep the coffee fresh." I thanked her and paid for my gas, then went back outside to fill up the tank. The cold was brutal, and the wind nearly knocked me over twice. By the time I finished, I was shivering uncontrollably. Back inside, Betty had indeed made fresh coffee, and it tasted like heaven after the ordeal outside. I sat at one of the diner tables, trying to warm up and waiting for the storm to calm down. "You from around here?" I asked, making conversation. "Born and raised," Betty replied. "Been running this place for, must be going on 20 years now. Business must be pretty slow in weather like this." "You'd be surprised," she said, and something in her tone made me look up from my coffee. "We get a lot of travelers on nights like this. People who take the wrong exit end up here by accident." "Wrong exit? Route 2's a dangerous road in winter," Betty continued, wiping down the counter with methodical precision. "Easy to get turned around, especially in a storm. Sometimes people end up places they never intended to go." I was about to ask what she meant when I heard another car pull up outside. Through the windows, I could see headlights cutting through the storm. A moment later, the door chimed, and a man stumbled inside, covered in snow and shivering. He looked to be in his 50s, wearing a business suit that was completely inadequate for the weather. His face was pale with cold, and his hands were shaking as he approached the counter. "Thank God," he gasped. "I thought I was going to die out there. My car broke down about a mile back." Betty smiled that same tired smile. "Welcome to Vanishing Point, honey. Coffee's fresh." The man, his name was Robert, I learned, had been driving from Billings to Minneapolis when the storm hit. Like me, he'd taken the exit to Vanishing Point, thinking it was a regular town. His car had died just after he left the highway, and he'd walked through the blizzard to reach the gas station. "Lucky you found us," Betty said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Not many people know about this place." "I've never heard of Vanishing Point," Robert said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "It's not on my GPS." "GPS doesn't always work out here," Betty replied. "Too remote. But don't worry, you'll figure out where you are soon enough." Something about the way she said that made my skin crawl. I excused myself and went to the restroom, partly because I needed to use it and partly because I wanted a moment to think. The restroom was clean, but old, with fixtures that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1980s. As I washed my hands, I noticed something odd about my reflection in the mirror. I looked pale, almost translucent, as if the fluorescent lights were shining through me instead of on me. I splashed cold water on my face and looked again. The effect was still there, subtle but unmistakable. I looked like a ghost. When I returned to the main area, Robert was deep in conversation with Betty about road conditions and tow trucks. But I noticed he had the same translucent quality I'd seen in my own reflection. In the harsh fluorescent light, he looked like he was fading away. "Betty," I said, interrupting their conversation, "how long has this storm been going on?" She looked at me with those sad, tired eyes. "Oh, honey, This storm's been going on for a very long time, longer than you might think." "What do you mean?" "Time works differently here," she said simply. "In Vanishing Point, some storms never end." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "I need to get back on the road. The storm's letting up, right?" Betty shook her head. "I'm afraid not. Once you're here, the storm doesn't let up. Not until it's ready." Robert looked confused. "What are you talking about? It's just weather. It has to end eventually." "Check your phone," Betty suggested gently. "Check the date." I pulled out my phone, expecting to see the current date in February. Instead, the screen showed a date from 3 months ago. Robert's phone showed a date from last year. "That's impossible," I whispered. "The storm brings people here," Betty explained, her voice taking on a dreamlike quality. "People who get lost, who take the wrong exit, who end up where they're not supposed to be, and once you're here, you're part of Vanishing Point forever." I looked around the gas station with new eyes. In the fluorescent light, I could see other figures now, translucent people sitting at tables or browsing the aisles. Travelers from different times, all caught in the same eternal storm. "How long have you been here?" I asked Betty. "Since 1987, she said. "I was driving to see my sister in Fargo. Took the wrong exit in a snowstorm. Been keeping this place running ever since, helping other lost souls find their way. Here." The truth hit me like a physical blow. We weren't waiting out a storm. We were part of it, trapped in some kind of temporal loop, doomed to replay the same night over and over again. I ran for the door, but when I pushed it open, there was nothing outside but swirling white void. No parking lot, no highway, no world at all, just the endless storm that had become our prison. Behind me, Betty's voice was gentle but final. "Welcome to Vanishing Point, honey. The coffee's always fresh and the storm never ends." I turned back to face the gas station, and in the fluorescent light, I could see my own reflection becoming more and more transparent. Soon, I'd be just another ghost helping Betty serve coffee to the next lost traveler who took the wrong exit on a snowy night. If you're ever driving Route 2 in winter and you see signs for a town called Vanishing Point, keep driving. Don't take that exit, no matter how bad the storm gets. Because some detours lead to places you can never leave, and some storms are designed to last forever. I was working the oil fields in North Dakota, driving a water truck between well sites during the height of the Bakken boom. It was good money, but the hours were brutal and the roads were worse, especially in winter, when a simple supply run could turn into a life-or-death situation. This particular night in January, I was hauling water from a treatment plant near Williston to a drilling site, about 40 miles north. The weather had been decent when I left around 10 p.m., just light snow and manageable wind. But North Dakota weather can change faster than you can blink, and by the time I was halfway to my destination, I was driving through hell. The blizzard came out of nowhere, one of those prairie storms that turns day into night and erases the world around you. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet, and the wind was strong enough to rock my loaded truck. I should have pulled over and waited it out, but the drilling crew was expecting that water, and downtime costs thousands of dollars per hour in the oil patch. I was creeping along at maybe 15 miles per hour, following the faint outline of the road, when I saw the lights ahead. Not headlights. These were stationary, like someone had set up flares or emergency beacons. As I got closer, I could make out what looked like a small convoy of vehicles pulled over on the shoulder. There were 3 trucks, 2 pickups, and what looked like a service van, all with their hazard lights flashing. I could see figures moving around in the storm, people in heavy winter gear. It looked like they were dealing with some kind of breakdown or accident. They pulled my water truck over and climbed down from the cab, grabbing my flashlight and pulling my hood up against the wind. The cold hit me like a sledgehammer, but I'd worked in worse conditions. If someone needed help, I wasn't going to drive past. "Everything okay here?" I shouted over the wind as I approached the group. There were 4 of them, all wearing identical heavy winter coveralls with reflective strips. In the swirling snow and darkness, I couldn't make out their faces clearly, but they seemed to be working on one of the pickup trucks. "Engine trouble," one of them called back. His voice sounded strange, muffled by the storm, but somehow too clear at the same time. "Been stuck here for hours." "You got a radio?" I asked. "I can call for a tow truck if you need one." "No signal out here," another voice said. This one was definitely female, though I still couldn't see her face clearly. "Storm's too bad." That was true enough. My own radio had been nothing but static for the past hour. But something about the situation felt off. These people were too calm for being stranded in a blizzard, too organized, and their vehicles, despite supposedly being broken down, were running with exhaust visible in the frigid air. "What kind of engine trouble?" I asked, moving closer to the pickup they were working on. "Take a look," the first man said, gesturing toward the open hood. I stepped forward and shone my flashlight into the engine compartment. What I saw made my blood freeze. There was no engine. The entire engine bay was empty, just a hollow space filled with swirling snow. I stumbled backward, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. "What the hell?" "Problem?" the woman asked, and now I could hear something wrong with her voice. It was too flat, too emotionless, like someone reading lines from a script. I turned to run back to my truck, but the 4 figures had moved to surround me. In the beam of my flashlight, I caught glimpses of their faces, and what I saw made me want to scream. They weren't quite human. The features were right. Eyes, nose, mouth, but everything was slightly off, like a photograph that had been distorted. Their skin was too pale, almost translucent, and their eyes reflected the light like an animal's. "You shouldn't have stopped," the first man said, and his voice was definitely not human now. It sounded like wind through a broken window, like the storm itself was speaking. I broke free from their circle and ran toward my truck, slipping and sliding on the ice. Behind me, I could hear them following, their footsteps crunching in the snow with a rhythm that didn't match human movement. I reached my cab and threw myself inside, slamming the door and hitting the locks. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and threw the truck into gear. In my mirrors, I could see the 4 figures standing motionless in the storm, watching me drive away. But as I pulled back onto the road, I realized something that made my heart sink. The road ahead looked exactly the same as the road behind. Same snow-covered asphalt, same fence posts barely visible in the storm, same endless white void stretching in all directions. I drove for what felt like hours, but the landscape never changed. No landmarks, no signs, no indication that I was making any progress at all. It was like driving on a treadmill, covering distance without actually going anywhere. My fuel gauge, which had been at 3/4 full when I stopped to help, was now showing less than a quarter tank. That was impossible. I'd only been driving for a few hours, and my truck got decent mileage even when loaded. That's when I saw the lights again. Up ahead, the same 3 vehicles were pulled over on the shoulder. Same hazard lights flashing, same figures moving around in the storm. It was exactly the same scene I'd encountered before, down to the smallest detail. I slowed down, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. I must have gotten turned around in the storm, driven in a circle somehow. But the road had been straight, and I'd been following it carefully. As I crept past the scene, one of the figures looked up and waved at me. In the glow of my headlights, I could see its face clearly for the first time. It was wearing my face. Not similar to mine, it was exactly my face, down to the scar on my chin from a childhood accident. I floored the accelerator, my water truck lurching forward into the storm. Behind me, I could hear laughter that sounded like wind through broken glass. I drove harder this time, pushing my speed up to 30 miles per hour despite the conditions. The truck skidded and slid on the ice, but I didn't care. I had to get away from whatever was happening on that stretch of road. But it didn't matter how fast I drove or how far I went. Every hour I encountered the same scene. The same 3 vehicles, the same 4 figures, the same impossible situation, and each time, one of them was wearing a different face. Sometimes mine, sometimes faces I didn't recognize, sometimes faces that looked familiar but wrong, like distorted memories. My fuel gauge continued dropping at an impossible rate. By the 5th encounter, it was showing empty, but the truck kept running. The clock on my dashboard had stopped working, frozen at 11:47 p.m. My radio was nothing but static, and my cell phone showed no signal and a battery that never seemed to die. I was trapped in some kind of loop, doomed to drive the same stretch of road over and over again while those things played with me like a cat with a mouse. On the 7th encounter, I decided to try something different. Instead of driving past, I stopped my truck and got out. The 4 figures approached me, their movements eerily synchronized. "Why?" I asked them. "What do you want?" "Company," the one wearing my face said. "It gets lonely out here in the storm, lonely and cold." "How long have you been here?" "Time doesn't work the same way in the storm," another one replied, this one wearing the face of a woman I'd never seen before. "Could be days, could be decades. Hard to tell when every night is the same." I looked around at the endless white void, the road that led nowhere, the storm that never ended. "Am I dead?" "Not yet," my doppelganger said. "But you're getting there. Each time you drive the loop, you leave a little bit of yourself behind. Eventually, there won't be enough left to keep going. And then you'll join us, help us flag down the next driver who's foolish enough to stop and offer assistance." I understood then. These weren't people at all. They were echoes, shadows of drivers who'd gotten lost in previous storms, trapped in an endless loop until they faded away completely, leaving behind only the compulsion to trap others. I ran back to my truck and drove off again, but I knew it was hopeless. I was a part of the loop now, part of the storm's collection. Each time I encountered the scene, I felt a little less real, a little more like an echo myself. I don't know how many loops I've driven now. The fuel gauge stopped working completely. The clock remains frozen, and I can feel myself becoming more transparent with each pass. Soon, I'll be standing on the shoulder with the others, wearing someone else's face, waiting for the next lost soul to stop and offer help. If you're ever driving through the Bakken fields in a winter storm and you see vehicles pulled over with their hazards flashing, don't stop. Keep driving, no matter how much your conscience tells you to help. Because some people can't be saved, and some storms are designed to claim drivers one by one, trapping them in an endless loop of false emergencies and impossible roads. The storm is always hungry, and it's always looking for new faces to wear. I was driving my girlfriend home to Rochester after visiting her parents in Fargo when the storm hit Highway 52 like a freight train. We'd been dating for about 6 months, and this was my first time meeting her family. It had gone well. Too well, maybe, because we'd stayed later than planned, and now we were driving through southern Minnesota in the middle of what the Weather Service would later call a historic blizzard. Sarah was asleep in the passenger seat, curled up under a blanket with her head against the window. She'd had a few glasses of wine with dinner and dozed off about an hour into the drive. I didn't have the heart to wake her, even as the weather got progressively worse. The snow started as light flurries around 9 p.m., but by 10:30 it was coming down so hard that my windshield wipers could barely keep up. The wind was brutal, gusting strong enough to push my SUV around on the highway. I'd slowed down to maybe 30 miles per hour, hazard lights flashing, trying to follow the faint outline of the road. That's when I saw the other car. It was a sedan, maybe a Toyota or Honda, sitting sideways across both lanes about 100 yards ahead. No lights, no hazards, just a dark shape blocking the highway. I hit my brakes and felt the SUV slide on the ice before coming to a stop about 50 feet away. The impact of the sudden stop woke Sarah up. She blinked groggily and looked around, trying to orient herself. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "There's a car blocking the road," I said, putting the SUV in park but leaving the engine running. "Looks like they might have slid off and gotten stuck." Sarah peered through the windshield at the dark shape ahead of us. "Are they okay? Should we help?" I was already reaching for my phone to call 911, but there was no signal. The storm was too intense, and we were in one of those dead zones between cell towers that plague rural Minnesota. "I'm going to check on them," I said, grabbing my flashlight from the glove compartment. "Be careful," Sarah said, pulling her blanket tighter around herself. "This weather is insane." I stepped out into the blizzard and immediately regretted not bringing a heavier coat. The wind cut through my jacket like it was made of paper, and the snow stung my face like tiny needles. I had to lean into the wind to keep from being blown over. As I approached the sedan, I could see that it was definitely stuck. The car was sitting at a 45-degree angle across both lanes, its front end buried in a snowdrift that had formed against the guardrail. But what struck me as odd was that there were no tire tracks leading to its current position. It was as if the car had simply materialized in the middle of the highway. I knocked on the driver's side window with my flashlight. "Hello? Are you okay in there?" No response. The windows were fogged up from the inside, which meant someone had been in the car recently, but I couldn't see any movement. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it opened easily. The car was empty, but the engine was still warm. The keys hung from the ignition, and the gas gauge showed half a tank. On the passenger seat, I found a purse and a cell phone. The phone was locked, but I could see several missed calls from someone named Mom. What really bothered me was the condition of the car's interior. No signs of panic or struggle. The seat was adjusted normally, there was a half-empty coffee cup in the cup holder, and a pair of reading glasses sat neatly folded on the dashboard. It looked like the driver had simply vanished mid-journey. I called out into the storm, "Hello? Is anyone out there?" But my voice was swallowed by the wind. If someone had left the car for any reason, they would have been invisible in the whiteout within seconds. I was about to head back to my SUV when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the snow around the abandoned car, there were no footprints, none at all, not even the ones I should have made walking from my vehicle. The snow was falling fast, but not that fast. There should have been some trace of human activity around a car that had been occupied just minutes before. Instead, the snow lay pristine and undisturbed. I backed away from the sedan, my heart racing. Something was very wrong here. I needed to get back to Sarah and figure out how to get around this obstacle. But when I turned toward where I'd parked, my SUV was gone. I stood there in the storm, staring at empty highway where my vehicle had been idling just minutes before. Like the footprints around the sedan, there was no trace it had ever been there. No tire tracks, no depression in the snow. Nothing. "Sarah!" I screamed into the wind. "Sarah, where are you?" No response. Just the howling of the blizzard and the sound of my own panicked breathing. I ran to where my SUV had been parked, searching frantically for any sign of what had happened. But the highway was empty, covered in undisturbed snow, as if no vehicles had ever been there. My phone still had no signal, and the battery was draining fast in the cold. I was stranded in a blizzard with no transportation, no way to call for help, and no explanation for what was happening to reality around me. That's when I heard the voice. "Help me!" Someone called from the direction of the abandoned sedan. "Please, help me." It was a woman's voice, young, scared, but it wasn't Sarah's voice. I turned back toward the car, my flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. There was someone in the driver's seat now, a silhouette barely visible through the fogged windows. "Are you okay?" I called out as I approached. "What happened to you?" "I'm lost," the voice replied, muffled by the glass. "I've been driving for hours, but I can't find my way home. I reached for the door handle, but something made me hesitate. The voice was wrong somehow, too clear for someone speaking from inside a car during a blizzard. And there was an echo to it, as if it were coming from far away. "Where are you trying to get to?" I asked. "Rochester," the voice said. "I'm trying to get to Rochester, but the roads keep changing. Nothing looks familiar anymore." Rochester. That's where Sarah and I had been heading. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "What's your name?" I asked. There was a long pause before the voice answered. "Sarah." My heart stopped. That was impossible. Sarah had been in my SUV, asleep under her blanket. This couldn't be her. "Sarah what?" I pressed. "What's your last name?" Another pause. "I don't remember," the voice said, and now there was something different about it. Less human. "I've been driving for so long, I don't remember who I am anymore." I backed away from the car, my mind reeling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I was having some kind of breakdown, or hypothermia was affecting my judgment. But as I retreated, I heard more voices. They seemed to come from all directions, carried on the wind. "Help me," one called from somewhere to my left. "I'm lost." My car broke down, another voice said from behind me. "I need a ride." "I've been waiting for hours," a third voice added from the darkness ahead. "Why won't anyone stop?" The voices multiplied, overlapping, creating a chorus of lost souls calling for help in the storm. And underneath it all, I could hear Sarah's voice. My Sarah's voice, calling my name from somewhere in the white void. I ran toward the sound of her voice, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I stumbled through the snow. But no matter which direction I went, her voice always seemed to be coming from somewhere else. "Sarah," I screamed. "Sarah, where are you?" "I'm here," her voice replied, but it was fading, becoming more distant. "I'm right here, but I can't see you. Everything looks the same." I realized then what was happening. We were all lost in the same storm, trapped in some kind of supernatural blizzard that existed outside normal space and time. The abandoned cars, the missing vehicles, the voices in the wind. We were all part of it now. The storm wasn't just weather. It was something alive, something that fed on lost travelers, trapping them in an endless white maze where roads led nowhere and vehicles disappeared without explanation. I don't know how long I wandered in that storm, calling Sarah's name and following voices that led nowhere. Time seemed to have no meaning in the whiteout. My phone died, my flashlight dimmed, and eventually I couldn't feel my hands or feet anymore. When they found me 3 days later, I was sitting in the abandoned sedan on Highway 52, hypothermic and barely conscious. The car had been there for hours, they said, blocking traffic until a snowplow finally cleared the road. Sarah was never found. Her body, her belongings, even any record of her existence seemed to have vanished along with my SUV. The police treated it as a missing person case, but they couldn't explain how a car and its occupant could simply disappear without a trace. I tried to tell them about the storm, about the voices and the impossible geography of that night, but they chalked it up to hypothermia-induced hallucinations and trauma from the accident. But I know what really happened. Sarah is still out there, trapped in that supernatural blizzard, driving endless roads that lead nowhere. And on nights when the snow falls heavy in Minnesota, I can sometimes hear her voice on the wind, calling my name from somewhere in the white void. If you're ever driving through a winter storm and you hear voices calling for help, don't follow them. Don't stop for abandoned cars or mysterious figures in the snow, because some storms are designed to collect lost souls, and once you're part of the blizzard, you'll be driving those empty roads forever. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. I was driving from Minneapolis to Des Moines for a job interview, taking Interstate 35 south through Iowa. It was supposed to be a routine trip. 5 hours of highway driving through familiar territory. I'd made this drive dozens of times over the years, visiting family and friends. I knew every exit, every rest stop, every landmark along the way. But this time was different. This time, the storm was waiting. The weather forecast had called for light snow, maybe an inch or two starting around midnight. Since I was leaving Minneapolis at 6 p.m., I figured I'd be in Des Moines long before the weather became an issue. I'd driven in much worse conditions than what they were predicting. The first few hours went smoothly. Light traffic, clear roads, no problems. I made good time through the Twin Cities metro area and was cruising through southern Minnesota right on schedule. The snow started just as I crossed into Iowa, gentle flakes that sparkled in my headlights like glitter. But somewhere around mile marker 180, everything changed. I first noticed it when I passed the same rest area 3 times in 20 minutes. The Pilot Travel Center near Clear Lake. I knew it well, had stopped there many times before. But according to my odometer, I'd driven 60 miles since the first time I saw it, which should have put me well past Mason City. I pulled over at the rest area and checked my GPS. According to the satellite navigation, I was exactly where I should be, making normal progress south on I-35. But I knew I'd seen this same building, this same exit, this same configuration of gas pumps just minutes before. I went inside and bought a coffee, trying to shake off the weird feeling. The clerk was a young guy, maybe college age, with the kind of bored expression you see on night shift workers everywhere. "Rough night to be traveling," he said as I paid for the coffee. "Yeah, snow's picking up," I replied, though it really wasn't that bad yet. "How far to Des Moines from here?" "About 2 hours in good weather," he said, "but with this storm coming in, might take longer." 2 hours. That was exactly what it should be from this location. I thanked him and headed back to my car, telling myself I was just tired and paranoid. But as I pulled back onto the interstate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The highway looked different somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had changed. The mile markers seemed to be in the wrong places, and the exit signs weren't quite right. I drove for another hour, watching the mile markers count down toward Des Moines. Everything seemed normal until I saw the sign for the Pilot Travel Center near Clear Lake again. This time, I didn't stop. I kept driving, watching my odometer carefully. But 20 minutes later, there it was again. The same rest area, the same exit, the same gas station I'd visited twice already. I was stuck in some kind of loop, driving the same stretch of interstate, 35 over and over again. It was impossible, but it was happening. The snow was getting heavier now, and the wind was picking up. What had started as light flurries was turning into a legitimate blizzard. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I was apparently trapped in about 20 miles of highway, doomed to drive the same section of road for eternity. I tried taking different exits, but they all led to the same few small towns: Clear Lake, Mason City, a handful of rural communities I'd never paid much attention to before. No matter which route I took, I always ended up back on I-35, heading south toward the same stretch of highway. My gas gauge was dropping, but not at a normal rate. I'd been driving for what felt like hours, but the needle had barely moved. My cell phone showed the time as 11:47 p.m., but it had shown the same time for the past hour. The clock in my car was frozen too. I was trapped in more than just a geographical loop. I was stuck in time itself. On my 5th pass by the Pilot Travel Center, I decided to stop again. Maybe the clerk could explain what was happening, or at least confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I walked inside, it was a different person behind the counter. An older woman this time, maybe in her 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I was just here an hour ago," I said. "There was a young guy working. Where did he go?" She looked at me strangely. "I've been here all night, honey. Haven't seen any young guy." "That's impossible. I bought coffee from him. We talked about the weather." "You feeling okay?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. "You look a little pale." I bought another coffee and sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to process what was happening. Either I was having some kind of breakdown or reality itself was malfunctioning around me. I decided to try an experiment. On my next pass through the loop, I would leave something at the rest area, a marker to prove I'd been there before. I found a pen in my glove compartment and wrote my name on a napkin from the coffee shop. When I reached the pilot station again, I went inside and left the napkin on the counter, telling the clerk, a different person again, this time a middle-aged man, that I'd left something behind and would be back for it. 20 minutes later, when I completed the loop and returned to the rest area, the napkin was gone. The clerk was different, too. Now it was a teenage girl who insisted she'd been working alone all night. I was trapped in a nightmare version of Groundhog Day, but instead of reliving the same day, I was reliving the same 20-mile stretch of highway, and each time through the loop, reality shifted slightly, like a photograph that had been copied so many times it was starting to lose detail. The storm was getting worse with each iteration. What had started as light snow was now a full blizzard, with wind strong enough to rock my car, and visibility dropping to almost zero. But the strangest part was that the storm seemed to be getting worse backward. It was most intense at the northern end of the loop and lighter at the southern end. It was as if the storm was the source of the loop, the thing that was trapping me in this impossible situation. On my 10th pass through, I decided to try something different. Instead of fighting the loop, I would embrace it. I would drive as slowly as possible, examining every detail of the highway, looking for clues about what was happening. That's when I started noticing the other cars. They were subtle at first, headlights in my rearview mirror that disappeared when I looked directly at them, tail lights ahead that vanished when I got too close. But as I paid more attention, I realized there were dozens of vehicles sharing the loop with me. Some were modern cars like mine. Others looked older, vehicles from the 80s and 90s, even a few that looked like they were from the 70s. All of them were driving the same endless circuit, trapped in the same supernatural blizzard. I tried to flag down other drivers, flashing my lights and honking my horn, but they never responded. They just kept driving, following their own predetermined paths through the loop. On my 15th pass, I saw something that made my blood freeze. There was my own car, driving about a quarter-mile ahead of me. Same make, same model, same license plate. I could even see myself behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead with the same expression of confused determination I'd been wearing for hours. I was watching myself from a previous loop, or maybe a future one. Time had become meaningless in this place, folding back on itself like origami. I followed my other self for a while, watching him make the same decisions I'd made, stop at the same rest area, have the same conversations with clerks who weren't quite real. It was like watching a movie of my own life, but one where the plot never advanced. The fuel gauge in my car had stopped working entirely, but the engine kept running. The clock remained frozen at 11:47 p.m. My phone showed no signal and a battery that never seemed to drain. I was part of the loop now, part of the storm's collection of lost drivers, and I realized that I would keep driving the same stretch of highway until I became like the others. A ghost car with a ghost driver, endlessly circling through a supernatural blizzard that existed outside of normal time and space. I don't know how many loops I've driven now, dozens, maybe hundreds. The storm never ends, the road never changes, and I never reach Des Moines. I just drive and watch other versions of myself drive and occasionally see new cars join the endless procession of the lost. If you're ever driving Interstate 35 through Iowa in a winter storm and you start seeing the same landmarks over and over again, get off at the next exit and don't get back on. Find a hotel. Call in sick. Do whatever you have to do to avoid becoming part of the loop. Because once you're trapped in the endless mile, there's no escape. There's just the storm, the road, and the terrible knowledge that you'll be driving the same 20 miles of highway forever, watching yourself make the same journey over and over again until the end of time. The storm is always hungry for new drivers, and Interstate 35 has plenty of room for one more ghost car in its endless parade of the lost. I was driving through the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, taking back roads to avoid construction on Highway 18. It was a route I'd never taken before, but my GPS showed it would save me about an hour on my trip from Rapid City to Omaha. What I didn't realize was that some roads aren't meant for outsiders, especially not on nights when the old spirits are restless. The reservation roads were rougher than I expected, narrow two-lane blacktop that hadn't been maintained in years. My rental car bounced and rattled over potholes and frost heaves, and I started to regret taking this shortcut. But I was already committed, miles from the main highway, and turning back would cost me more time than pressing forward. The snow started around 9 p.m., light at first, but quickly intensifying. Within an hour, it was coming down so hard that my headlights could barely penetrate the white curtain ahead of me. I slowed to a crawl, following the faint outline of the road and hoping I wouldn't end up in a ditch. That's when I saw the figure standing in the middle of the road. It was an elderly Native American man, wearing traditional clothing that seemed completely inadequate for the blizzard. He stood motionless in my headlights, not moving aside as I approached. I hit my brakes and came to a stop about 20 feet away from him. I rolled down my window and called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. His long gray hair whipped in the wind, but he didn't seem to be affected by the cold or the driving snow. I put the car in park and got out, pulling my jacket tight against the wind. "Sir, you need to get out of the road. It's dangerous to be out here in this weather." As I approached, the man finally spoke. His voice was deep and resonant, carrying easily over the sound of the storm. "You don't belong here," he said. "This is not your road." "I'm just passing through," I replied. "My GPS said this was the fastest route to the interstate." The man shook his head slowly. "Your machines don't understand the old ways. Some roads are meant to stay hidden. Look, I'm sorry if I'm trespassing, but I'm lost in this storm. Can you help me find my way back to the main highway?" "The storm will show you the way," the man said. "But first, you must understand what you have awakened." Before I could ask what he meant, the man stepped aside and gestured for me to continue down the road. I wanted to offer him a ride, to get him out of the blizzard, but something about his manner suggested that would not be welcome. I got back in my car and drove slowly past him. In my rearview mirror, I watched him disappear into the swirling snow, as if the storm had swallowed him whole. The road ahead was getting worse, barely visible under the accumulating snow. But I pressed on, hoping to find a town or at least a house where I could wait out the storm. What I found instead was something that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. The first sign that something was wrong was the landscape itself. The rolling prairie I'd been driving through for hours had given way to something else entirely. Rocky hills and deep ravines that shouldn't have existed in this part of South Dakota. The road wound through terrain that looked more like the Badlands than the Pine Ridge area. Then I saw the lights. They appeared in the distance, flickering like campfires scattered across the hills. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't fires at all. They were some kind of natural phenomenon, balls of light that danced and swirled in the storm, moving with purpose and intelligence. The lights began to converge on my car, surrounding me as I drove. They pulsed with different colors, blue, green, white, red, and they seemed to be communicating with each other in some kind of visual language. I tried to speed up, but the road was too treacherous. The lights kept pace with me easily, floating alongside my car like curious spirits. And that's when I realized what they might be. Ghost lights, will-o'-the-wisps, the spirits of the dead according to Native American folklore. I'd always dismissed such stories as superstition, but faced with the impossible reality dancing around my car, I was forced to reconsider. The lights led me deeper into the strange landscape, guiding me along roads that seemed to appear and disappear as needed. Sometimes I was driving on asphalt, sometimes on dirt, sometimes on what felt like ancient stone. The storm continued to rage, but within the circle of lights, I felt oddly protected. After what felt like hours of this supernatural escort, the lights suddenly dispersed, leaving me alone on a road I didn't recognize. The storm had intensified, and visibility was down to maybe 10 feet. I was completely lost in terrain that shouldn't have existed. That's when I saw the village. It appeared out of the snow like something from another time. Traditional Native American dwellings arranged in a rough circle, smoke rising from fires that somehow burned despite the blizzard. People moved between the buildings, going about their daily activities as if the storm didn't exist. I stopped my car and stared at the impossible scene. This had to be some kind of historical recreation, a tourist attraction or educational site. But what would something like that be doing in the middle of nowhere, and who would be working there during a blizzard? As I watched, several people from the village approached my car. They were dressed in traditional clothing from what looked like the 19th century, and they moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. An elderly woman reached my window first. Her face was weathered but kind, and her eyes held a depth of knowledge that seemed to span centuries. "You are far from home," she said, her voice somehow audible despite the storm. "The spirits have brought you to us for a reason." "I'm lost," I admitted. "I was trying to get to the interstate, but this storm came up, and now I don't know where I am." "You are exactly where you need to be," the woman replied, "but you cannot stay. This place is not for the living." The implication of her words hit me like a physical blow. "Are you saying you're dead? We are the ones who walked this land before the roads were built, before the boundaries were drawn. We remain here because this is sacred ground, protected by the old spirits." More figures gathered around my car, and I could see that they were translucent, like images projected onto the storm. They were ghosts, the spirits of a people who had lived and died on this land generations ago. "The road you took tonight is one of the old paths," the woman continued. "It appears only when the spirits wish to teach a lesson or deliver a warning. You have seen things that few living people are meant to see." "What kind of warning?" "That some places are not meant to be traveled by outsiders. That the earth remembers all who have walked upon it, and sometimes the dead have things to say to the living." The ghostly figures began to fade as the storm intensified. But before the woman disappeared entirely, she spoke one final time. "Follow the lights," she said. "They will lead you back to your world. But remember what you have seen here. Remember that the land has a memory, and respect the places where the spirits still walk." The ghost lights returned then, surrounding my car in their ethereal glow. They guided me through the storm, along roads that shifted and changed beneath my wheels. Sometimes I was driving through the ghostly village, sometimes across open prairie, sometimes through landscapes that existed only in dreams. When the lights finally dispersed, I found myself back on Highway 18, the main road I'd been trying to avoid. The storm was clearing, and in the distance I could see the lights of a truck stop. According to my GPS, I was exactly where I should be, as if I'd never left the main highway at all. I pulled into the truck stop and sat in my car for a long time, trying to process what had happened. When I finally went inside to buy coffee and ask about the reservation roads, the clerk looked at me strangely. "Reservation roads?" he said. "There aren't any roads through the Pine Ridge that connect to this highway. Haven't been for decades. They were all washed out in the floods of '93 and never rebuilt." I showed him my GPS route, but the roads I'd taken weren't on any map. According to every official source, the path I'd driven simply didn't exist. But I know what I experienced that night. I know I drove roads that belonged to another time, guided by spirits who still protect sacred land from those who would disturb it. The storm wasn't just weather. It was a manifestation of spiritual power, a way for the dead to communicate with the living. If you're ever driving through South Dakota and your GPS suggests a shortcut through reservation land, think twice before taking it. Some roads exist only when the spirits will them to, and some journeys are meant to teach lessons rather than save time. The land remembers everything, and sometimes the dead have important things to say to those who are still among the living. Respect the places where spirits walk, and they might just guide you safely home. I was driving from Duluth to International Falls along the North Shore when I decided to take a shortcut through the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. County Road 12 looked promising on my map, a straight shot through the Superior National Forest that would save me about an hour. What I didn't know was that some roads in northern Minnesota have their own rules, especially when the winter storms roll in from Lake Superior. The weather had been decent when I left Duluth around 7 p.m., just light snow and manageable wind. But as I headed inland, away from the moderating influence of the lake, the temperature dropped and the snow began falling harder. By the time I was deep in the forest, I was driving through a legitimate blizzard. County Road 12 was narrower than I'd expected, a 2-lane ribbon of asphalt that wound through dense stands of pine and birch. There were no streetlights, no houses, no signs of civilization anywhere, just endless forest and the hypnotic sweep of my headlights through the falling snow. I'd been driving for about an hour when I realized I hadn't seen another car since leaving the main highway. That wasn't unusual for a back road in the middle of nowhere, but something about the complete absence of traffic felt wrong. There should have been logging trucks at least, or local residents heading home from work. The forest around me was unnaturally quiet. Even through the closed windows of my car, I should have been able to hear wind in the trees or the sound of snow hitting branches. Instead, there was only silence, a deep, oppressive quiet that seemed to muffle even the sound of my engine. That's when I saw the first sign. It was a standard highway marker, green with white letters, but the message was wrong. Entering White Silence Township, it read. Population variable. I'd never heard of White Silence Township, and the variable population notation was bizarre. Who puts variable on a population sign? I made a mental note to look it up when I got home, assuming it was some kind of local joke or artistic statement. But as I continued down County Road 12, more strange signs appeared. White Silence Township, Historic District. White Silence Township, established 1847, abandoned 1923, re-established 1967. White Silence Township, visitors welcome, departure not guaranteed. That last one made my skin crawl. What kind of town puts departure not guaranteed on their welcome sign? The forest began to thin out, and I could see lights ahead, the warm glow of a small community nestled in a clearing. As I crested a small hill, the town of White Silence spread out before me, and it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The buildings looked like they were from different time periods. Victorian houses sat next to 1950s ranch homes, which neighbored log cabins that could have been built in the 1800s. Some structures looked brand new, while others appeared to be falling apart. But all of them were occupied. Lights glowed in windows, smoke rose from chimneys, and I could see people moving around inside. The strangest part was that there was no snow on the buildings or streets. Despite the blizzard raging around the town's perimeter, White Silence itself existed in a bubble of calm. The snow fell right up to the town limits and then stopped, as if held back by an invisible barrier. I drove slowly down the main street, marveling at the impossible meteorology. People walked on the sidewalks without winter coats, as if it were a pleasant spring evening. They waved at me as I passed, friendly gestures that somehow felt more ominous than welcoming. I needed gas, and I spotted what looked like a vintage service station from the 1960s. The sign read, "Olson's Gas and Service, serving White Silence since 1967. I pulled up to the pumps and got out of my car. The air was warm and still, completely different from the howling blizzard I'd been driving through just moments before. I could hear birds singing in the trees and the distant sound of children playing. It was like stepping into a different season, a different world entirely. An elderly man emerged from the service station, wearing coveralls and a friendly smile. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying a slight Scandinavian accent. "Don't get many visitors this time of year. You heading somewhere special?" "International Falls," I replied, still trying to process the surreal weather conditions. I was taking County Road 12 as a shortcut, but I've never seen anything like this. "How is it not snowing here?" The man, his name tag said Olson, chuckled. "White Silence has its own climate, you might say. Always has, ever since the town was re-established. We're protected here." "Re-established?" The sign said something about the town being abandoned. "Oh yes," Olson said, beginning to fill my gas tank. "Original settlement was wiped out in the winter of 1923. Terrible blizzard, lasted for weeks. When the snow finally melted, there was nobody left. Just empty buildings and a lot of questions. What happened to the people? Nobody knows for sure. Some say they got lost in the storm, others think they just moved on. But the town sat empty for 44 years until some folks decided to give it another try." I looked around at the anachronistic buildings, the impossible weather, the people who seemed to exist outside of normal time. "Are you one of the original resettlers?" Olson's smile faltered slightly. "You could say that. Been here since '67 anyway. Time works differently in White Silence. Some of us have been here longer than others, even if we all arrived the same year." That didn't make any sense, but nothing about this place made sense. I paid for my gas and asked for directions back to the main highway. "Just continue on County Road 12, Olson said. "It'll take you right where you need to go. But you might want to stay the night. Storm's getting worse out there, and the road can be unpredictable after dark." I thanked him, but declined the offer. I wanted to get out of White Silence as quickly as possible. The town felt wrong, like a movie set or a theme park designed to look like a real community. The people were too friendly, the weather was too perfect, and the whole place had an artificial quality that made my skin crawl. I got back in my car and drove to the far edge of town, where County Road 12 continued into the forest. But as soon as I crossed the town limits, I was back in the blizzard. The contrast was jarring. One moment I was driving through a calm spring evening, the next I was fighting through a whiteout that threatened to send me off the road. I drove for what felt like hours, following the narrow road through the forest. But something was wrong with the distance. According to my odometer, I'd driven over 100 miles since leaving White Silence, but the forest looked exactly the same. Same trees, same curves in the road, same mile markers. That's when I realized I was seeing the same mile markers over and over again. Mile 47, mile 48, mile 49, then back to mile 47. I was driving in a loop, trapped on a section of County Road 12 that somehow led back to itself. I tried turning around, but the road behind me looked identical to the road ahead. No matter which direction I drove, I ended up at the same mile markers, passing the same landmarks, making no progress toward either White Silence or the outside world. My fuel gauge was dropping, but not at a normal rate. I'd been driving for hours, but the needle had barely moved. My phone showed no signal, and the clock was frozen at 11:23 p.m. I was trapped in some kind of temporal loop, just like I'd been trapped in White Silence's bubble of artificial calm. The town wasn't just protected from bad weather, it was protected from time itself, existing in a pocket dimension where the normal rules didn't apply. After my 5th loop through the same mile markers, I gave up and drove back to White Silence. I had no choice. It was the only place that seemed to exist in this strange corner of Minnesota. Olson was still at the gas station when I returned, as if he'd been waiting for me. "Decided to stay the night after all?" he asked with that same friendly smile. "I can't get out," I said. "The road just loops back on itself. What's happening here?" "White Silence takes care of its own," Olson replied. "And sometimes it decides that visitors need taking care of too." "I don't understand." The town was abandoned in 1923, but it was never really empty. The spirits of the original settlers remained, waiting for someone to bring the community back to life. When we arrived in 1967, we thought we were re-establishing a ghost town. What we really did was join the ghosts. The truth hit me like a physical blow. The people of White Silence weren't alive. They were spirits, trapped in an endless loop of small-town life. And now I was trapped with them. "How long?" I asked. "Time doesn't matter here," Olson said. "Could be days, could be decades. Eventually, you'll stop counting, stop caring. White Silence has a way of making people feel at home." I looked around at the impossible town, at the people who had died decades ago, but still went about their daily routines. The warm air, the singing birds, the children playing. It was all an illusion, a supernatural bubble designed to trap the living among the dead. I don't know how long I've been in White Silence now. The calendar on the wall of the motel where I'm staying never changes, and the sun never quite sets or rises. It's always evening here, always that perfect moment between day and night when small towns feel most alive. The other residents are kind, welcoming me into their eternal community. They don't seem to remember being alive or dying or the passage of time between then and now. They just exist, playing their roles in an endless performance of small-town life. If you're ever driving through northern Minnesota and you see signs for White Silence Township, keep driving. Don't stop for gas. Don't stop for directions. Don't stop for anything. Because some towns exist outside of time, and once you become part of their story, you'll never reach your original destination. The storm is always raging just outside the town limits, and County Road 12 always leads back to where you started. In White Silence, every road leads home, and nobody ever really leaves. I was driving across southern Minnesota on Highway 14, heading from Rochester to Mankato for my sister's wedding rehearsal. It should have been a simple 2-hour drive through familiar farm country, but the weather forecast was calling for a significant winter storm. I probably should have left earlier, but I'd been stuck at work dealing with a crisis, and by the time I got on the road, it was already getting dark. The snow started just west of Owatonna, light flurries that looked innocent enough in my headlights. But within 30 minutes, it had escalated into something much more serious. The wind picked up, visibility dropped, and I found myself white-knuckling it at 30 miles per hour on a highway where I normally cruised at 70. I was somewhere between Waseca and New Ulm when I saw the accident. It was a bad one. A semi had jackknifed across both lanes, and there were at least 3 cars involved. Emergency vehicles were already on scene, their red and blue lights flashing through the snow. Traffic was backing up behind the accident, and it looked like the highway would be closed for hours. I pulled over behind a line of other stranded vehicles and called my sister to let her know I'd be late. But my phone showed no signal, not unusual in rural Minnesota during a storm. I'd have to wait it out and hope the road crew could clear the accident quickly. That's when I noticed something odd about the other cars. There were maybe a dozen vehicles pulled over ahead of me, all with their hazard lights flashing, but none of them had anyone in them. Every car was empty, engines still running, exhaust visible in the cold air, but no drivers or passengers anywhere to be seen. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching for signs of life. Maybe everyone had gone to check on the accident victims, or to see if they could help with the cleanup. But as time passed, nobody returned to their vehicles. I started to feel uneasy. I got out of my car and walked up to the nearest vehicle, a Ford Explorer with Iowa plates. The engine was running, the heater was on, and there was a coffee cup in the cup holder that was still warm. But no sign of the driver. I checked the next car, then the next. All the same. Engines running, personal belongings inside, but no people. It was as if a dozen drivers had simply vanished into thin air. The accident scene was about a quarter-mile ahead, barely visible through the blowing snow. I started walking toward it, thinking I'd find the missing drivers there, helping with the emergency response. But as I got closer, I realized something was very wrong with the accident itself. The semi was jackknifed across the highway, just as I'd seen from a distance, but there were no emergency vehicles. No ambulances, no fire trucks, no police cars. The flashing lights I'd seen were coming from the hazard lights of the crashed vehicles themselves, and like the cars behind me, all the vehicles involved in the accident were empty. I approached the overturned semi cautiously. The cab was crushed, the trailer was blocking both lanes, and there was debris scattered across the highway, but there was no blood, no bodies, no sign that anyone had been injured or killed. The driver's door of the semi was hanging open, and I could see that the keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat was a clipboard with shipping paperwork dated 3 days ago, but no driver, no indication of what had happened to the person who'd been behind the wheel when the truck jackknifed. I walked among the other crashed vehicles. A minivan with Nebraska plates, a sedan from Wisconsin, a pickup truck with local Minnesota tags. All empty, all still running, all abandoned as if their occupants had simply evaporated. The storm was getting worse, and I was starting to feel genuinely frightened. This wasn't just a traffic accident. It was something much stranger and more sinister. An entire convoy of vehicles had been abandoned on Highway 14, and I was the only living person for miles around. I started back toward my car, but in the blowing snow and darkness, I quickly became disoriented. The highway looked different than it had just minutes before. The lane markers were in the wrong places. The guardrails seemed to have shifted, and I couldn't see the line of abandoned cars I'd walked past earlier. I pulled out my phone and tried to use its flashlight to navigate, but the screen was completely black. Not dead. Black, as if it were displaying an empty void. When I tried to turn it on, nothing happened. The device was completely unresponsive. That's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But as I stood still and listened, I could make out distinct words and phrases carried on the storm. "Help me," one voice said, seeming to come from somewhere to my left. "I can't find my car," another voice called from the darkness ahead. "The road is gone," a third voice whispered from behind me. I spun around, trying to locate the speakers, but I couldn't see anyone in the swirling snow. The voices seemed to be coming from all directions, overlapping and multiplying until they formed a chorus of lost souls calling for help. I ran toward where I thought my car was parked, but the highway had changed. Instead of the familiar 2-lane road I'd been driving on, I found myself on a 4-lane divided highway with a concrete median barrier. The pavement was different too. Older, more worn, as if it hadn't been maintained in years. My car was nowhere to be seen. In fact, there were no cars anywhere, just an empty highway stretching into the darkness in both directions. I was completely lost, stranded on a road that shouldn't exist, surrounded by voices of people I couldn't see. The storm continued to rage around me, but now it felt malevolent, purposeful, as if it were actively trying to disorient and trap me. I started walking east, following the highway and hoping to find some landmark or sign that would help me figure out where I was. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, with no exits, no signs, no indication that I was making any progress at all. The voices followed me, always just out of sight, always calling for help or directions or rescue. And slowly, I began to understand what they were. They were the voices of other drivers who had gotten lost on Highway 14 during previous storms. People who had taken the wrong exit or followed the wrong road or somehow ended up on a version of the highway that existed outside normal space and time. I was walking through a supernatural traffic jam, a collection of lost souls who had been trapped by the same malevolent storm that now held me prisoner. As I walked, I began to see evidence of other travelers, abandoned cars from different eras, vehicles from the 1990s, the 1980s, even older models that looked like they were from the 1970s. All empty, all still running despite having been there for decades. The storm wasn't just weather. It was some kind of supernatural phenomenon that collected lost drivers, trapping them in an alternate version of Highway 14 where time moved differently and geography followed its own rules. I don't know how long I walked on that impossible road. Hours, maybe days. The storm never let up, the voices never stopped calling, and the highway never led anywhere. I was trapped in an endless loop of winter road construction, doomed to walk forever on a highway that existed only to collect the lost and confused. Eventually, I stopped walking and sat down on the guardrail. There was no point in continuing. Every direction led to the same nowhere. Every step took me further from the real world and deeper into the storm's supernatural domain. That's when I saw the headlights. They appeared out of the snow like a miracle, growing brighter as they approached. A car was driving toward me on the impossible highway, the first moving vehicle I'd seen since this nightmare began. I stood up and waved my arms, trying to flag down the driver. The car slowed and stopped next to me, and I could see a woman behind the wheel, looking confused and frightened. "Thank God," she said as she rolled down her window. "I've been driving for hours, but I can't find my way back to the main road. Do you know where we are?" I looked at her car, at her clothes, at the style of her hair. Everything about her screamed 1980s. She was another lost driver, trapped in the storm decades ago, but still trying to find her way home. "We're lost," I told her. "All of us. This isn't the real Highway 14. She looked at me with growing horror as the truth sank in. "How long have you been here?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Time doesn't work the same way here." The woman started to cry, and I realized I was looking at my own future. I would drive these roads forever, occasionally meeting other lost souls, all of us trapped in the storm's supernatural web. If you're ever driving Highway 14 in southern Minnesota during a winter storm and you see abandoned cars on the shoulder, don't stop to help. Keep driving, stay on the main road, and don't take any exits that don't look familiar. Because some storms collect more than just snow. They collect drivers who get lost in the white darkness, trapping them on roads that lead nowhere and highways that exist only in the space between one world and the next. The voices are still calling in the storm, and there's always room for one more lost soul on the endless highway. I was driving north on Highway 169 from the Twin Cities to Grand Rapids, making the trip to close on a cabin I'd inherited from my grandfather. It was supposed to be a routine drive through central Minnesota, but the weather forecast was calling for a major winter storm. I should have postponed the trip, but the closing had already been delayed twice, and I was eager to finally take ownership of the property. The storm hit just north of Princeton, transforming what had been light snow into a full-scale blizzard within minutes. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the wind was strong enough to rock my SUV. I slowed to a crawl, following the faint red glow of taillights ahead of me. The car I was following belonged to another driver dealing with the same nightmare conditions. We formed an impromptu convoy, 2 vehicles creeping through the whiteout at maybe 20 miles per hour. I couldn't see the driver clearly through the storm, but I was grateful for the guidance. As long as I could follow those tail lights, I knew I was still on the road. We drove like this for over an hour, a slow-motion procession through the white hell. But somewhere north of Milaka, the car ahead of me began to behave strangely. It started weaving slightly, drifting toward the shoulder, then correcting back to the center line. At first, I thought the driver was just fighting the wind and ice like I was. But then the car began to slow down even more, dropping to maybe 10 miles per hour. The taillights seemed dimmer too, as if the battery was dying. I flashed my headlights, trying to signal the driver to speed up or pull over, but there was no response. That's when I realized something was very wrong with the vehicle ahead of me. Through the swirling snow, I could see that the car was covered in a thick layer of ice. Not the kind of ice you get from driving through a storm, but the kind that forms when something has been sitting motionless in freezing conditions for hours or days. The entire vehicle looked like it had been encased in a crystal shell. But it was still moving, still maintaining just enough speed to stay ahead of me. The tail lights continued to glow through the ice, and exhaust was still visible from the tailpipe. Someone was definitely driving, but how was that possible with the car frozen solid? I tried to pass, but the road was too narrow and the conditions too dangerous. I was stuck behind this impossible vehicle, following a driver who shouldn't have been able to see through the ice-covered windshield. After another 30 minutes of this surreal convoy, the car ahead of me finally pulled over to the shoulder. I stopped behind it, leaving my engine running and my hazards flashing. Through my windshield, I could see the other vehicles sitting motionless, completely encased in ice, but somehow still running. I sat in my warm SUV for several minutes, debating what to do. Every instinct told me to drive around the stopped car and continue on my way, but what if the driver needed help? What if someone was trapped inside that frozen vehicle? Finally, my conscience won out. I grabbed my emergency kit and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold was brutal, cutting through my winter gear like it was made of paper. I had to lean into the wind to keep from being blown over. As I approached the frozen car, I could see that it was even stranger up close. The ice wasn't just coating the exterior. It seemed to be growing from within the vehicle itself, as if the car were generating its own winter weather. Frost patterns covered the windows in intricate designs that looked almost like writing in a language I didn't recognize. I knocked on the driver's side window with my gloved fist. "Hello? Are you okay in there?" No response, but I could see a shadowy figure behind the wheel. The ice on the windows was too thick to make out details, but someone was definitely inside. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it opened easily despite the ice. The interior of the car was like stepping into a freezer. My breath immediately formed clouds, and I could feel the cold seeping through my clothes. The driver was still behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. But something was terribly wrong. The person, I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, was completely motionless, covered in a thin layer of frost. Their eyes were open but unseeing, and their skin had the pale, waxy appearance of someone who had been dead for a long time. I backed away from the car, my heart racing. This wasn't a stranded motorist. This was a corpse, somehow still driving through a Minnesota blizzard. But as I retreated, the dead driver's head slowly turned toward me. The frozen eyes focused on my face, and the frost-covered lips moved, forming words I could barely hear over the wind. "Cold," the corpse whispered. "So cold. Need warmth." I ran back to my SUV and threw myself inside, slamming the door and hitting the locks. My hands were shaking as I put the vehicle in drive and pulled around the frozen car. In my rearview mirror, I could see the dead driver watching me leave, that terrible, frozen face tracking my movement. I drove as fast as I dared through the storm, desperate to put distance between myself and the impossible scene I'd just witnessed. But after about 10 minutes, I saw headlights in my mirrors. The frozen car was following me, somehow managing to keep pace despite its condition. I sped up, pushing my SUV to dangerous speeds on the icy highway. But no matter how fast I drove, those dim taillights stayed with me, always maintaining the same distance. The dead driver was pursuing me through the blizzard, and I had no idea what it wanted. That's when I started seeing more of them. Other cars began joining the procession, emerging from side roads and on-ramps like ghosts materializing from the storm. All of them showed signs of long exposure to extreme cold, ice-covered, windows, frost-damaged paint, the unmistakable appearance of vehicles that had been abandoned in winter weather. But they were all moving, all driving with the same slow, purposeful speed. And through their frozen windshields, I could make out the silhouettes of more dead drivers, corpses who had somehow returned to continue their final journeys. I was being followed by a convoy of the frozen dead, drivers who had died in previous winter storms but refused to stop driving. They formed a ghostly procession behind me, their dim headlights cutting through the snow like the eyes of hunting predators. I tried taking different exits, hoping to lose them on back roads, but they followed every turn. No matter where I went, the dead drivers stayed with me, their numbers growing as more frozen vehicles joined the convoy. My fuel gauge was dropping fast, but the dead cars seemed to run on something other than gasoline. They never stopped, never slowed down, never showed any signs of mechanical failure. Death had freed them from the normal limitations of automotive travel. As my gas tank approached empty, I realized I would soon be stranded on the highway with nowhere to run. The convoy of frozen dead would surround me, and I would become another victim of the supernatural blizzard. But just as my engine began to sputter, I saw lights ahead, the warm glow of a truck stop, a beacon of civilization in the white wilderness. I coasted into the parking lot on fumes, my SUV dying just as I reached the building. I looked back toward the highway, expecting to see the convoy of dead drivers following me into the truck stop. But the road was empty. The frozen cars had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving no trace they had ever existed. Inside the truck stop, I tried to explain what I'd seen to the clerk, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. When I went back outside an hour later, after the storm had passed, there was no sign of the supernatural convoy. Just a normal Minnesota highway, clear and empty under the stars. But I know what I experienced that night. I know I was followed by drivers who had died in winter storms but refused to stop driving. They're still out there, somewhere on Highway 169, waiting for the next blizzard to continue their endless journey. If you're ever driving through central Minnesota during a winter storm and you see a car covered in ice still moving on the highway, don't follow it. Don't try to help. Just drive in the opposite direction as fast as you can, because some drivers never reach their destination. They just keep driving forever, collecting other souls to join their frozen convoy. The dead have their own roads, and the living should never travel them. I was driving from Fargo to Minneapolis on Interstate 94, making the trip for a job interview that could change my life. It was a route I'd driven dozens of times, but never in weather like this. The blizzard came out of nowhere, one of those prairie storms that can turn a routine drive into a fight for survival. I was somewhere between Sauk Center and St. Cloud when the storm reached its peak. Visibility was down to maybe 15 feet, and the wind was strong enough to push my car around like a toy. I should have pulled over and waited it out, but I was already running late for my interview, and I thought I could push through the worst of it. That's when I saw the exit sign. It appeared out of the snow like a mirage. Last exit, 1 mile. I'd never seen that sign before, and I'd driven this stretch of I-94 hundreds of times. There was no exit between Sauk Center and St. Cloud that I could remember, certainly not one called Last Exit. But as conditions continued to deteriorate, the idea of getting off the interstate became more appealing. Maybe there was a truck stop or restaurant where I could wait out the storm. I was burning through gas at an alarming rate, fighting the wind. My fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank. The exit appeared exactly where the sign had promised. It was a standard off-ramp. Nothing unusual about it except that I couldn't remember it being there before. But memory can play tricks, especially in stressful conditions. Maybe I'd just never noticed this particular exit. I took the ramp and found myself on a two-lane road that seemed to stretch into infinity. No buildings, no lights, no indication of where the road led. Just endless white void on both sides. But I was committed now. Turning around on the narrow ramp in these conditions would be more dangerous than pressing forward. I drove for what felt like 20 minutes, following the road through the storm. My headlights cut through the snow, revealing nothing but more road ahead. No signs, no landmarks, no indication that I was heading toward any kind of civilization. Just as I was starting to panic, I saw lights ahead. Not the warm glow of a town, but the harsh fluorescent glare of what looked like a rest area or truck stop. It sat alone in the prairie, a beacon of hope in the white wilderness. As I got closer, I could see it was indeed a truck stop, complete with gas pumps and what appeared to be a small restaurant. The sign out front read, "Last Exit Travel Plaza, open 24 hours." There were no other vehicles in the parking lot, which seemed odd for a truck stop during a blizzard. I pulled up to the gas pumps and sat in my car for a moment, engine running. Something about the place felt off, though I couldn't identify exactly what. The building looked normal enough, typical truck stop architecture from the 1990s. But it seemed too isolated, too perfect, like a movie set designed to look like a real business. I needed gas desperately, and I needed to get warm. I stepped out into the blizzard and immediately noticed something strange. Despite the storm raging all around the area, there was no wind or snow in the immediate vicinity of the truck stop. It was as if the building existed in a bubble of calm weather. The gas pump was old-fashioned, the kind where you had to pay inside first. I hurried toward the building, my shoes crunching on pavement that was mysteriously clear of snow. Inside, the truck stop looked exactly like every other one I'd ever been in. Rows of snacks and road atlases, a coffee station, a few tables near a small restaurant counter. But like the parking lot, it was completely empty. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed strangely in the silence. A man emerged from behind the counter, middle-aged, wearing a uniform shirt with "Last Exit" embroidered on the pocket. He had a friendly smile, but his eyes looked tired, almost sad. "Evening," he said. "Rough night to be traveling. You heading somewhere important?" "Minneapolis," I replied, stamping imaginary snow off my shoes. "Got turned around in the storm and saw your exit sign. How far back to I-94? The man's smile faltered slightly. "I-94? Oh, friend, you're not going to make it back to I-94 tonight. Storm's only getting worse." "What do you mean?" "I just got off at your exit 20 minutes ago." "Time works differently here," the man said, his voice taking on a dreamlike quality. "Some exits don't lead back to where you came from." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "What kind of exit is this?" "The last one," he replied simply. "The final stop for drivers who get lost in storms like this. Once you take the last exit, there's no going back." I backed toward the door, but when I looked through the windows, my car was gone. The parking lot was empty, covered in undisturbed snow as if no vehicle had ever been there. "Looking for something?" the man asked, still wearing the sad smile. "My car. Where's my car?" "You don't need it anymore. Nobody who comes to the last exit needs their car anymore." I ran outside, but the truck stop was surrounded by nothing but white void. No road, no exit ramp, no connection to the outside world. Just the building floating in an endless sea of snow and darkness. "This isn't real," I said, more to myself than to the man who had followed me outside. "Real is a relative concept," he replied. "You're here. I'm here. The truck stop is here. What more reality do you need?" "How long have you been here?" "Since 1987, he said. "I was driving from Grand Forks to Minneapolis, got caught in a blizzard just like you. Took the last exit thinking I could wait out the storm. Been waiting ever since." The truth hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a real truck stop. It was some kind of supernatural trap, a place where lost drivers ended up when they took the wrong exit during a storm, and now I was trapped here with them. How many others? I asked. Dozens over the years, maybe hundreds. Hard to keep track when time doesn't move forward. As if summoned by his words, other figures began to emerge from the building. Men and women of various ages, all wearing the same tired expression, all dressed in clothes from different decades. They were the other drivers who had taken the last exit, trapped in this impossible place between the real world and somewhere else. "Welcome," a woman said, her voice hollow and distant. "We've been waiting for you." "I don't want to be here," I said. "I need to get back to I-94. I have a job interview." "Everyone has somewhere they need to be," an elderly man replied. "But the last exit doesn't care about your schedule. It only cares about collecting lost souls." I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The truck stop existed in a void, surrounded by nothing but swirling snow and darkness. Every direction led to the same nowhere. "Don't fight it," the original clerk said gently. "Fighting only makes it harder. Accept your new reality, and the last exit will take care of you." I looked around at the other trapped souls, at their resigned faces and empty eyes. They had all given up, accepted their fate as permanent residents of this supernatural truck stop. And slowly, I felt my own resistance beginning to fade. The storm outside never ended, the clock on the wall never moved, and the coffee was always fresh. Time had no meaning at the last exit, and neither did hope. I don't know how long I've been here now. Could be days, could be years. The other residents are kind, sharing their stories of the storms that brought them here. We're all united by the same experience, taking the wrong exit at the worst possible moment. If you're ever driving Interstate 94 during a winter storm and you see a sign for last exit, keep driving. Don't take that ramp, no matter how bad the weather gets or how low your fuel gauge drops. Because some exits don't lead to truck stops or rest areas. They lead to places where time stops and travelers never leave. The last exit is always open, always welcoming new customers, but checkout time never comes, and the road back to the real world doesn't exist. We're still here, waiting for the next lost driver to join our eternal community of the stranded and forgotten. Closing note. The storm eventually passes, but some roads never lead home. Some exits exist only to collect the lost, and some drivers never reach their destinations. If you made it through these stories, you're one of the lucky ones. You're still in the real world, still able to choose which roads to travel. But remember what you've heard tonight. When the snow falls heavy and the wind howls across the prairie, when visibility drops to nothing and you're tempted to take that unfamiliar exit or follow those mysterious taillights, think twice. Because in the white silence of a winter storm, reality becomes negotiable and some detours last forever. The roads are still out there, waiting for the next storm to reveal them, and somewhere in the endless white, drivers who took the wrong turn decades ago are still looking for the way home. Thanks for listening, and remember, not all who wander are lost, but some who are lost never stop wandering.